Well, it kind of seems like my boredom traveling throughout space is finally peaked. I have thousands upon thousands of light years left to travel, and yet I have nothing to do. So I guess it's about time I don't know, maybe like picked up a podcast. But who should I listen to? Well, luckily, I have these 23 candidates. Yes, today we are going to go through each and every Lethal Company entity and rate them on how well I think they could host their own podcast. Now, what will today's criteria be? Authenticity, consistency, structure, audience engagement, storytelling, guests, and of course, the podcast name and cover art. Now, as always, let's hop right in and see who is a podcast perfectionist and who is a podcast fiasco. So to kick things off this go around, we're going to go in alphabetical order. So first off, we have the baboon hawk, the giant bird ape kangaroo thingamabopper that likes to hop around and agitate the absolute crud out of you. Baboon hawks are territorial. They do at least like their own kind. So if one were to start a podcast, I find that all of them would listen in on it. Baboon hawks would have their own audience engaged, but for us simple orange jumpsuited folk, I find that the podcast material would be too catered to their own kind to have anything of substance for the regular employee, such as myself. Now, at least they would know what their audience wants and would be consistent with their material. Similarly, I do think that they would purely want to have guests that were also other baboon hawks and nobody else. And so it would be stale to the non-baboon hawk fan base, if there even was such a thing. And lastly, we go to what their name and cover art would be. I think they would talk mainly about stuff they collected and or stole from us employees on their show, and therefore I think their name would be something along the lines of Collecting Connoisseurs of the Gamma Quadrant, with a cover art of them holding up something like a shiny gold chalice into the air. Overall, at least the Baboon Hawks would have something structured enough to resemble a decent podcast, even though it may not be for our tastes. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to start off, and I'm going to place the Baboon Hawk into the B tier. So next up, we have our favorite beat-colored stalker in the dark. We have the Bracken. Now, immediately we know what content the Bracken would produce. It would be scary time / horror stories to make the audience quiver in fear, while the Bracken is simply talking about his typical Tuesday afternoon. Now, we also know that there is plenty of horror, mystery, and drama people out there in the podcast world that enjoy that stuff. And so I know that the Bracken can easily gather an audience and probably keep them engaged quite a bit. I think the guests that would come over on the show would be the collection of deceased fans he's collected over the years, and so the guests wouldn't have too much to add on to the conversation unless the Bracken is like describing them or some whatever reason. The Bracken would also only talk about more dark and bleak themes that would be overall consistent, but then again, it would overall maybe a little bit of a kind of depressing theme. Some more issues with this. People may send in fan letters to the Bracken, who in turn would know where to go to show fans some quote-unquote appreciation. But nonetheless, as long as we do not give in and send all sorts of fan letters and gifts, the Bracken would seem to be a pretty solid choice when it comes to podcasting. Now, what would the title of the Bracken podcast be? I think it would be something along the lines of 1,000 plus ways to show heaven, with something ominous like an outstretched hand over a black background. I think this would entice the average space viewer such as myself, so it's not going to make it all the way up into the S tier, but I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to place the Bracken into the A tier. So following up the Bracken, we have the monster all people with arachnophobia love. We have the bunker spiders. I mean, like, what would spiders even talk about in their podcast? Probably something like how damp and cool conditions are perfect for arachnids, or like the model of home that they construct with their webs, and sharing detailed plans on how they went on about it, what they like to feast on when they catch it in said webs. I mean, I find that the bunker spider would be pretty monotone and repetitive in their podcast, and therefore their engagement and audience would be pretty minimal. Their guests would just be their prey that they'd paralyzed, or more of their own, so other bunker spiders. So they would be pretty low in that category as well. Bunker spiders at least can make something for someone out there who likes the niche lifestyle that those big spiders live day to day. So I think the bunker spiders would also have the name of something like Silken Prey, an average spider's life, with the cover art being like an oil-based picture of a bunker spider with its two forward arms just touching. Overall, I think the bunker spider would be pretty low on this list, but it's not going to make it all the way at the bottom. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to place the bunker spider into the D tier. So up next, we have one of the newer Lethal Company entities. We have the Butler. The Butler seems to give off vibes similar to that of the Bracken, in which his podcast would be centered around him stalking his prey or something along those lines. But in comparison to the Bracken, I find that the Butler would be a little bit more difficult to enjoy their content, as the Butler seems a little less able to express their stories and dialogue. I find that the Butler gives off that creepy, yes, master, kind of henchman tone, and that just seems to be a nuisance to listen to for a great duration of time. The Butler just doesn't scream out exciting and new stories and content. As for the title of the Butler's podcast, I think the name would be somewhat pretentious. I'm thinking something along the lines of The Butler, a gentleman's inquiries, with the cover art being just a few of stereotypical chores that a butler performs each day, but they're blurred in the background and there's just like a simple black bow tie in the foreground. Overall, I find the Butler to be both good and bad, more or less just a meh podcast performer. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to place the Butler, he's going to go into the C tier. So here we come to another legendary entity that is known far and wide throughout the Lethal Company community. We have the Circuit Bees. Now, obviously, the bees have an audience, aka other bees. Would we want to listen in on that? Here's some footage and audio of what it looks like in the bee studio. Now, bees, they could talk about the drama unveiling within their hives, maybe something about a worker finally meeting the end that they knew well, or how there's rumors about a new upcoming queen to take the throne. I don't know, I'm not a circuit beekeeper. Overall, though, the audio for us non-bee people would be basically impossible to listen to, even if we tried to use it as some, like, poor ASMR or something. Each episode, which may seem to be something incredible based off of the episode title and description, would end up just being some giant clickbait to fool all of us. As for the name for the Circuit Bees, it's going to be To Be or Not To Be, with something like a hexagonal honeycomb background and a bee holding up the employee helmet. Overall, I find this to be impossible to listen to, and as a fellow normal employee, and therefore, I'm going to place it all the way at the bottom. I'm going to place it into the F tier. Now we have the mannequin with the springy neck. We have the Coil head. The Coil head, in my mind, is that kind of silent, stoic type who has little to say and only wants bones to crack. The Coil head seems to have a fascination with that and only that. And if we are not in range, they just wander around with that sound effect that makes it sound like they have super wet feet. I think if you put a microphone in front of it, all you would hear is either the sounds of those feet moving or like some sort of heavy breathing. If the Coil head were to breathe for some reason, which it shouldn't because it's a mannequin. Now, that seems like a pretty bad ASMR session to me. And I feel like the Coil head would just title each podcast episode recording 1.mp3, recording 2.mp3, and so on and so forth. The Coil head would have a minimal audience if it were to even have one. So we know that the audience engagement would be minimal too. Guests would just be other mannequins, maybe some springs and coils on people's heads, and that's it. So there's no content there either. The title of Coilhead's podcast would be Podcast by Coilhead, with the cover art literally being just some cruddy selfie of the Coilhead. Overall, I find Coilhead to be the worst podcast host on this list so far, and therefore I'm going to follow him up with the Circuit Bees. I'm going to place the Coilhead into the F tier. So now moving on, we meet the Earth Leviathan, the monster wormy worm that detects the vibrations in the ground and consumes us whole. Now, worms themselves seem to be pretty boring, always just wiggling around and decomposing things to fertilize the soil. But a giant worm that eats just about anything? Now that seems pretty cool. I consider the main topic of conversation is about what was hunted or consumed today, or where they traveled by burrowing to said hunting grounds. If they wanted to really captivate an audience, perhaps they could bring on guests and then consume them when the podcast is just about over. Now, that would also take a lot of convincing and or kidnapping for that to occur, and they would somehow need to convince the guests to speak and not just like beg for mercy the entire time or something. This may seem sadistic, but once again, people love to listen to like a good crime story and stuff like that. So I think that the Earth Leviathans would be okay in that regard. Maybe the whole what did or / will I eat shtick will get old over time. But for a fresh new listener, I think they would enjoy that stuff quite well. So now, the name of the podcast, how about Underground Hunters or maybe Meat Chasers or something like that? I imagine the cover art being something like a camouflaged background with just a giant hole in the center of the image. Maybe with like a couple of worms' eyes staring out of said hole. Overall, I find that the Earth Leviathans would be pretty good and ready to start a podcast. Even though it may not be exactly perfect, I'm not going to put them all the way in the S tier, but I'm going to put the Earth Leviathans into the A tier, and I'm looking forward to hearing their content in the near future. Now we have the retinas removed giant canines, the Eyeless dogs, who love to come into the ship at the most inconvenient time and ensure that the run is absolutely ruined. But all that to say, I think the Eyeless dog is capable of something at least. It could bring on a multitude of guests, some containing bite marks in them and some not. I think that it would have something for the visually impaired, maybe something a bit inspirational on how a dog with no eyes to begin with can manage to not only live, but be one of those apex predators in their day-to-day lives. I think this would be pretty good content for the general audience, as long as it rotates its content over time to keep it fresh and exciting. Would the general populace be able to understand that the content that is being produced, all audio that comes from the eyeless dog is either heavy breathing or a bark when it decides to charge? And that's what seems to be a general issue with the eyeless dogs. They would simply just lunge forward when a guest decides to speak based upon their hunter's instincts. Maybe the guests could have some soundproofing between the two, or maybe they could just somehow do it remotely. I mean, I'm just spitballing ideas. No sight, all teeth would be the name, and they would have the cover art being the interior of a mouth with giant fangs around the border of the art, with a mildly scared guy in the middle looking up. Overall, I find that the eyeless dog is a little bit worse off than the previous entry, so I'm going to place them a tier below the Earth Leviathans. I'm going to place the eyeless dog into the B tier. Following up, we have the Forest Keeper, one who I find to be overall a not-so-good candidate to host a podcast, mainly due to one issue. They basically have a mindset of like a 5 or 6-year-old. Would you even listen to, say, an hour-long podcast of a child rambling on and on about who knows what? Now, don't get me wrong, the mind of a kid can be quite interesting, but over a long duration of time, I think it would be exhausting listening to a kid ramble on and on about anything and everything. The Forest Keeper would also just reach over and grab any equipment or guest or whatever it finds even slightly interesting and just throw it in its mouth and chew away. Now, at least there's a chance for some entertainment to come out of this podcast in some form or fashion. So some people would listen in, but over time, I think the audience would just diminish it pretty well. For the name of the Forest Keepers podcast, I find some long-winded name that is misspelled, like, this one time I found employee running and I grabbed him and I ate him, with the cover art just being something horrific but drawn by a kid, so it doesn't look quite as horrific. Now, overall, at least the Forest Keeper can maybe do something, as kids have been funny on podcasts before. So I'm not going to place the Forest Keeper all the way at the bottom in the F tier. I'm going to keep them a tier above. I'm going to place them into the D tier. So next up, we have the Ghost Girl, who immediately, I think, is high quality in terms of podcast material. She could basically haunt anyone and everyone, and therefore maybe she can somehow get the haunted people to perform as guests on her podcast by somehow manipulating them to. Of course, she is a little girl, and I literally did just rag on the average kid hosting a podcast, but this one is different to me. She has huge potential to kind of have this horror story / pranking podcast where guests who are invited onto the show are either getting pranked or helping prank someone else through the Ghost Girl's psychological horrors. So therefore, I'm sure she has story after story about her hauntings. So once again, she would have the horror audience captivated with them. She seems good enough to keep that same structure while rotating content enough to keep it new. I mean, like, wouldn't it be awesome to just have her there and hear her ask guests something so casual like, hey man, how scary was me haunting you? I mean, come on man, like, be for real with me. You know that she would be an authentic host too, because she does that super innocent skip animation while running towards you. So, I mean, who wouldn't believe her? Now, for the name of the podcast, I'm thinking something along the lines of My Worldwide Hauntings, with that old Jeb Bush pose of her and the background being just a random planet. Now, overall, I find that the Ghost Girl would be one of the you have to listen to this podcasts. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to give her the honor of being first to make it all the way up into the S tier. So following up with the queen of podcasts, we now have the legendary Hoarding bug. Now, obviously, we know what the content would be. It would just be tales about how they acquired their most unique loot over the days or weeks or years, and why they want to, quote-unquote, collect them so badly. Now, for guests, it would be similar to the Ghost Girl, where I find that they can get just about anyone on the show, but the guests will inevitably lose something of at least a little value to increase the loot that the Hoarding bug gets over time. Now, for the guests, as long as they bring something of at least a little bit of value, they are going to be okay once they depart. And as long as they don't touch anything of any of that loot in the recording studio, I think it'll be a pretty enjoyable experience. Now, again, I think that the people would enjoy the content as long as the Hoarding bug learns to rotate the material around and talk about different stories and ask about guests' favorite loot themselves. The Hoarding bug would obviously be authentic, as the content they produce would be their forte. Now, the name of the Hoarding Bug's podcast would be something along the lines of What I Collected and then in parentheses stole. with the cover art being just a huge mound of gold and treasure and whatnot, and the bug in front with like a big crown put on kind of sideways on its head, and maybe a pearl necklace or something. Overall, I find the concept for the Hoarding Bugs podcast to be pretty dang awesome. I'm going to place the Hoarding Bug all the way into the S tier. Following up the Hoarding Bug, we now have the entity that once again I feel like is in so many games. We have the Hydrodiri, which I am sure I will keep mispronouncing, so therefore I'm just going to go ahead and call them the Slime. Now, how does the Slime even connect with an audience? Can it connect with an audience? I find that the content of a slime to be just about how they move around and where they move to between each podcast recording, which for the Lethal Company slime would be a total of about 4.4 inches. Now, for the Lethal Company slime, we know it travels towards heat and oxygen, and therefore is just chasing some random organism that it has little to no chance of actually catching up to unless it corners itself. So that would be the majority of podcast material about what organism it thinks it is chasing and for how long. Even if we were to get some guests on the show, it would be just one of those super sloth-like questions where it takes a literal minute to ask the guest the question about how they're doing today. I just don't think the slime would be capable of too much beyond this. It just does not seem ready to hit the recording booth just yet. So the name of the podcast would be something super basic like It's Slimin' Timin', with the cover art being the most basic out of all the entities, being literally just a picture of it. I mean, that's it. I think the slime is one of the weakest candidates, and of course that means the slime is going to be placed all the way at the bottom into the F tier. So now we have the Jack in the Box gone crazy. We have the Jester. Now, when I think of the content the Jester makes, I think of Heath Ledger's Joker, where he has that cruddy audio and video of the fake Batman, and he is just recording himself and says,
"I'm a man of my word."
The Jester seems like it would somehow have the absolute worst setup of any of the entities, making some like really bad audio. We know that no guests could even manage to make it on the show. Well, at least not any that are alive. Maybe we could somehow get a live guest on the show and begin spinning that handle until, well, you know. So for the wicked-minded people, there's something, but otherwise, that just sounds terrible for the general populace. Maybe on a more uplifting note, if it didn't have any bad intentions behind it, it could structure its podcast around something more lighthearted, such as just like everyday conversation or something. Now, at least the Jester can maybe do something solo, but what it would do, I'm not too entirely sure. How about like the Jesting Gesture with a cover art of a somewhat kitty Jester on a coiled spring leaning over, maybe with a skull for the Jester's head to represent the host. At least the Jester can produce something for someone out there. So I'm going to keep it out of the F tier and I'm going to place it into the D tier. So now we have the perfect ASMR podcast candidate. We have the Manticoil, aka the four-winged bird. Now, all we need is for the Manticoil to simply sing a song for the audience and have some general nature sounds in the background, and we will automatically have a podcast that I think is better than a few previous entrants. I mean, that's really it for the bird. The podcast name could literally be something so basic as the Manticoil Macrocosm and have the most basic picture of nature as the cover art. If it were to do this ASMR thing, I think the Manticoil can just go directly into the C tier. So let the bird cook. Let that bird sing. So beyond the Manticoil, we have the Mast, who's once again giving off that creepypasta host vibes, talking about weird horror stories and whatnot. Does the Mast recollect stories of the person whose body it overtook? Does it store any memories of its own? Does it overtake different bodies or just remain with the one the entire time? I like to say yes to all the questions, even the one that really isn't a yes or no question. Now, if you were to give it the benefit of the doubt, again, we are about that on this channel, I would think the stories it would share would be pretty interesting. It would be pretty hard-pressed to find the average guest to be on the show, but I'm sure it could get another Mast on pretty dang easily. I think they would share about their own experiences, about what they've done, where they've been, how they've possessed the person they're attached to, stuff like that. Now, would this content have an audience backed behind it? I think to some degree, but the content could get boring if the Mast didn't attach itself or infect anyone or anything new over time. The title would be something along the lines of How I Took Over, which to some, they would mistake it for like some business podcast or something. The cover art would be all black except for the cutouts of an opera mask, unveiling maybe like another employee or something in front of the mask. I think the Mast would have an okay podcast, so I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to place the Mast into the B tier. So now we have the unhinged hornets that come out of the Butler. We have the Mast hornets. Now, we previously placed the Butler into the C tier, but that is because the Butler has some characteristics such as like a mouth and ears maybe. Now that the Hornets have lost that, I have lost basically all faith in their podcast producing abilities. I think the Masked Hornets are going to be pretty hard pressed to have any seance of a recording made that is worthy of uploading. I think they would pretty much be the same as any of the bugs, where the audience would be pretty niche and it would be one big question mark on what the content would actually be. The name of the podcast would be in reference to their Butler body lost, something like How We Lost It All or Bye Bye Butler Bod, with the cover art simply being a sad butler looking down. Now, I feel like this is a pretty obvious one, and I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to place the Masked Hornets all the way at the bottom. So now we have the Christmas-themed Nutcracker, who likes to patrol around and show off its cool weapon. Immediately, I think of the Nutcracker making content about some war stories, about how it served in some far-off military and fought on some far-off planet and earned itself some medals along the way, until one of the viewers digs into the stories and finds out that literally none of that content is true, and the Nutcracker is just performing some stolen valor publicity stunt. So obviously the authenticity wouldn't be there. Maybe it would pull in actual veterans to share their stories, in which the Nutcracker would just piggyback off of the real stories and say something like, "This reminds me of when I was serving in ... Now for the general audience who doesn't dig into the actual content too deep, maybe they wouldn't find out about the stolen valor. Maybe they would just follow the old saying of ignorance is bliss and just enjoy the podcast and take it at face value. So we come to the two sides where either people find out the Nutcracker's exploits and try to condemn it, or people who just listen just to hear interesting tales. The Nutcracker would have a title like A Hard Nut to Crack, A Combat Vet's Experiences, and the art would be something super pro-military with like the Nutcracker saluting and jets flying in the background with some cool vapor trails or something. Now again, I think the Nutcracker would be okay to some and horrendous to others, so I'm going to go ahead and put it in the middle, and I'm going to place the Nutcracker into the C tier. So following with the Nutcracker, we have the actual robotic war machine, the Old Bird. Now, of course, the main issue with the podcasting ability of the Old Bird is that it doesn't have any form of AI, so it can't advance in podcasting abilities. Now, maybe someone can at least sit it down and let it talk about its glory days of where it went and what it did. But of course, in terms of content, this would get old fairly quickly, and it would probably not tell it in the best storytelling fashion, making the content quite stale in a relatively short time. Guests would only be able to really ask the Old Bird a question in which it responds in the most monotone and overall boring fashion. So the Old Bird is able to produce at least something for the general public, but would not be very exciting and would run for a short duration before the content is finally all dried up. Now, the name of the podcast would be pretty boring too, such as A16-L31's podcast, and the art would once again just simply be a picture of the Old Bird behind a boring white background. The Old Bird can make something, but it would definitely not run for too very long. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to place the Old Bird into the D tier. Now, since it's considered an entity, we have to follow up with the most boring entity in Lethal Company, the roaming Locust. Is there anything at all to really say about the Locusts? No, y'all all know where I'm going to be going with this one. The name of the podcast would be Does Anyone Really Care? With the cover art being Use Your Imagination, automatic F tier. That's really it. Let's just move on. So up next, after the lamest entity in the game, we have the Snare flea, the giant bug that likes to suffocate fellow employees and have some fun along the way. The Snare flea seems to want to hunt and eat, and therefore I think it would own a podcast that focuses on that, hunting and cooking and eating. Perhaps we could find some excellent recipes as long as we substitute the meats that the Snare flea suggests with some more practical meats. The hunting aspect would be semi-interesting, as at least you would get to hear some cool stories about how the Snare flea made up for its weaknesses and ambushed some poor fellow that would probably feed the Snare flea for an entire decade. Now, the guests would again have the sense of danger going about, but the Snare flea only really ambushes and otherwise is pretty much unable to threaten the guests as long as they do not get too close to it or anything. The content would be interesting for the foodies out there, and I think that there are so many recipes and cooking ideas that the podcast wouldn't get too stale over time. The name of the podcast would follow the lines of how to hunt and how to eat, and then in parentheses, employees. And the art would be something like an employee's helmet turned upside down and used as a bowl with some nice broth inside. Overall, I find the Snare flea to be semi-decent in their podcasting abilities, and I feel pretty comfortable in placing them into the B tier. So now we have the adorable purple ball-tailed lizard creature. We have the Spore lizard. The Spore lizard, of course, has that adorable little walk and that big smile it likes to give while it shakes its tail around. Now, according to the bestiary, they were even attempted to be domesticated a long time ago, and therefore I think they can give their guests on the show some form of ease as they have a temperament that wants to avoid confrontation. The content of the Spore Lizard is what I think is the big question mark, but I think it'll be something along the lines of how to properly grow vegetables and fungi, and would give some pretty solid advice for the gardening community out there. They could even talk about their charity events that they participate in, as the Spore Lizard has its tail that is used for medicinal purposes. I think the Spore Lizard would have a personality that is chill, calm, and relaxing, with a soothing voice that is pleasant for all those who tune in. The Spore Lizard would also be as authentic as they come, because who doesn't love that big old lizard running around? The name of the Spore Lizard's podcast would be Bacterium and Gardening Galore, with the cover art being the Spore Lizard just like farming and gardening some like carrots or something. I find the wholesome little lizard to be top tier podcasting material, and so I'm gonna go ahead, I'm gonna place them at the top. I'm gonna place the Spore Lizard into the S tier. Well, now we have management on our butts asking us what we think of them hosting a podcast. So we have the company monster itself. Now, to be brutally honest, I do not see it doing much beyond talking about all the scrap they collect and how the business is ran. So of course, it's going to be a business management type of podcast. The company monster would also do this solo, as it doesn't seem to care for the only people it sees that we know of, which is us, the employees. I of course have some complaints that I would like to file with upper management, but I'm just gonna save that for another time. The business podcast would not be too great, as it deals with basically the same thing every day, of it getting annoyed by the employees and it just wants to receive and pay minimal and go about its day. Now the podcast would be something kind of bland, like how to operate a solar system wide business, and the cover art simply being something like a tentacle adjusting a tie. Overall, this seems to be pretty bland, so I'm gonna go ahead, I'm gonna throw the boss monster man into the C tier. Please let me keep my job. I have spaceship loan payments to make. Please, please, please. So now we have the Thumper, who likes to stomp around and make as much noise as possible doing it. The Thumper's content would obviously be about how it stays in shape, including the meals it has and the workout routine it does. The guests would obviously be other strong creatures, and there may be some fighting due to like the hunter's instinct instilled within the Thumper. So the guests would be threatened, but I think they can step up to the plate and have some sort of friendly brawling match that wouldn't get too violent, hopefully. The Thumper, of course, wouldn't know about sound levels due to its lack of the ability to hear, and therefore someone else would need to be on the podcast to ensure that the Thumper isn't too close to the mic and making the noises too loud, or perhaps they can just be edited post-recording. The audience engagement would be there for all the workout enthusiasts, especially those who like to skimp out on leg day. Now, the name of the podcast would be Thumping You Into Shape, with the cover art simply being the Thumper flexing and showing off their back muscles or something. Now, I find the Thumper to not be quite up there, but I feel good enough to place it into the A tier. So lastly on this list, we come across the brightly colored feathered brethren, the Tulip snake. So similarly to the Manticoils, maybe we could get the ASMR thing going on, where we get to hear the mating calls and other chants the tulip snakes make. But additionally, the tulip snakes would at least get to talk about what they picked up and dropped today, or how them and their buddies picked up an employee and let that employee fly around and enjoy themselves until they decided to quit flying around and that employee fell 80 feet and did not make it back to the ship. So it does have a bit more material in comparison to the Manticoil. The guests would obviously just be people and creatures they latched onto, so they could have quite a variety of guests on the show. The material, of course, would probably get stale over time, but again, it at least has a little bit more content in comparison to the Manticoil, the other bird. The name of the podcast would be something along the lines of Flying High in the Sky, with the art simply being like a tulip snake with a blue background with clouds and maybe an employee head on the bottom portion of the art. Now, overall, I think the tulip snakes deserve a tier higher than that of the Manticoil, and therefore, I'm going to place them a tier higher. I'm going to place them into the B tier. And there it is, another legendary tier list. We answered Lethal Company's most pertinent question of who would be the best at making a podcast. Tune in next week when we dive into one of my favorite game series and answer another resounding question that has been on everyone's mind since the game came out. I will say, if you enjoyed the video, of course, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And until the next video, folks, adios.